This is LSAT Prep Test 133, Section 4, Passage 1. This is a law passage about the legal definition of the word traditional in Alaska. Specifically, what happens when that definition runs into real people making real things from sea otter pelts. This is a medium difficulty passage. The reading is pretty straightforward, and there's a subtle trap built in. Now, this passage walks through courts trying to fix this situation. The main point here is that the term traditional in Alaska law was too narrowly defined by a federal agency, and the courts eventually struck that definition of the word traditional down. Now, paragraph 1 gives you the setup. The word tradition is everywhere in Alaskan law. It controls who gets access to land, resources, and exemptions. But here's the problem. The law almost never defines what the word traditional actually means. And that vagueness creates inconsistent results. You don't want to overthink this paragraph here. It's just telling you one thing. There's an undefined legal term combined with high stakes leads to trouble. Take that and then move on. Paragraph 2 is short, but you don't want to blow past it. It unpacks what most people assume the word traditional means, like long-standing practice. And this might sound simple, but it's not, because the word long-standing carries two separate ideas within it. One is just time passing. The other is that the practice has to be both continuous and regular. And that split is the core of the entire legal fight here. The paragraph ends by pointing you towards two court cases involving sea otter pelts. Paragraph 3 lays out the legal history. Sea otter hunting was banned in 1910. The Marine Mammal Protection Act of 1972 kept the ban, but carved out a narrow exemption. Alaskan natives could take sea otters to make traditional native handicrafts. Then the Fish and Wildlife Service stepped in and defined what counted. They said an item had to be commonly produced before 1972. And sea otter pelt items were not covered because no Alaskan native had made them within living memory. Now, the phrase within living memory is important here. That's where the Fish and Wildlife Service is drawing a bright line. If nobody alive remembers the practice, it's not traditional. And that might sound reasonable at first glance, but there's a massive blind spot here, and the court's about to expose it. Paragraph 4 is where they do that with the most important paragraph. You want to read this part slowly. In 1986, Fish and Wildlife Service agents seized sea otter pelt clothing from Marina Katelnoff, an Aleut woman. She sued, and the district court sided with the FWS. Then in 1991, Katelnoff joined a new case brought by Boyd Dickerson, a Tlingit man who'd had the same thing happen to him. This time, testimony showed that Alaskan natives had used sea otters extensively before Russia occupied the territory in the late 1700s. So the practice didn't fade on its own. It was cut off by colonization and then by federal law. And that changed everything. The court ruled that the Fish and Wildlife Service had based its regulations on a strained interpretation of the word traditional. The test of living memory was deemed to be too narrow. And the court's reasoning lands right at the end of the passage. Just because a group was forced to stop practicing a tradition doesn't mean the tradition stopped being a tradition. So defining traditional so that only recent practice counts would gut the word of its meaning. Now, the key move in this passage is that reversal at the end of paragraph 4. The Fish and Wildlife Service said, no living memory, no tradition. The court said, you can't erase a tradition by being the reason it was disrupted. So every hard question on this passage revolves around that conflict. Now, the author's stance here is mostly neutral. This is more like a legal survey than an argument, but you want to pay attention because the author clearly presents the court's reasoning as the more sensible position. The phrase strained interpretation is the court's word, not the author's. But the author gives that view the final say and doesn't push back on it, so that's a quiet endorsement. Now, the trap here is that students read this and think it's about sea otter pelts, but it's not. The pelts are just the example. The passage is about how a vague legal term gets defined, challenged, and then redefined. If you anchor your understanding on the pelts, instead of the fight over the definition, you're going to get pulled towards wrong answers that describe the facts instead of the legal argument. Now, the whole passage here is running on a chain of events. Vague statute leads to narrow regulation. Narrow regulation leads to seizures. Seizures lead to lawsuits. Lawsuits force the court to actually confront what the word traditional means. Each step only exists because the one before it broke down. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to make sure you're clear on these three things. First, what was the Fish and Wildlife Service's standard for traditional, and why did it exclude sea otter pelts? Second, what new evidence came in during the Dickinson case that wasn't there before? And third, why did the court say the Fish and Wildlife Service got it wrong? So that was passage 1. We're going to go on to passage number 2 now, just getting set up for it. This is LSAT Prep Test 133, Section 4, Passage 2, about Kate Chopin's literary development through the three phases of 19th century women's fiction, medium difficulty passage. Now, this is a humanities passage. It tracks how Chopin moved through three literary movements, sentimental novels, local color, and the New Women, and came out the other side with something none of them fully account for. The main point is that Chopin absorbed each phase, but her major work transcends all three. Now, the most important paragraph here is the fourth one. That's where the passage reveals what Chopin actually built from all these influences. Everything before is just laying down the groundwork. Now, paragraph 1 is just the timeline. Chopin grew up on sentimental novels that were elevated and romantic, all about courtship and social position. Then she started writing and took the local colorists as her models. You don't want to linger here, just lock in the sequence. Sentimental novels first, local color second. That is the foundation the rest of the passage builds on. Then paragraph 2 is about the world the local colorists were writing in. Women's culture, meaning women's growing presence in education, professions, and politics that had been expanding. The local colorists wrote about regional life as these new worlds opened up. But then that culture started to disappear. And when women's culture faded, the local colorists stopped observing and started mourning. The garden became a paradisal sanctuary. The house became a symbol. Domestic objects became almost sacred. They went from acting like anthropologists, that's the passage's own comparison there, by the way, to writing mythology about a world that was vanishing. So that shift from clear-eyed observation to idealization is something you're going to see in the questions for sure. Now, paragraph 3 is where Chopin breaks away from the pack. She's using the same local color conventions, but telling completely different stories about loneliness and isolation and frustration. And the passage is careful to say she did this without resorting to the excesses of those sentimental novels from her youth. And so Chopin threaded a needle here. She wanted real emotional intensity, but refused to go melodramatic. She could tell shocking or melodramatic tales, but still keep them grounded because she wrapped them in local color's matter-of-fact style. And that balance is the whole point of the paragraph. It doesn't really matter what Chopin wrote about, just that how she pulled it off. Now for paragraph 4, you want to slow way down, because this paragraph does pack in a lot, and the hardest questions are going to pull from it. Chopin did not share the local colorist nostalgia. That one line clearly separates her from everything in paragraph 2. By the 1890s, she's looking beyond them to the New Women. The passage then describes what the New Women did. They pursued freedom and innovation. They changed the novel's form. They made room for fantasy and stories about totally different worlds. They also experimented with impressionistic methods to explore female consciousness. Now, the passage says Chopin embraced this impressionistic approach more fully. So that phrase, more fully, means she took the New Women's own technique further than they did. And then the passage tells you what that produced. A novel unified not by style, not by content, but by its sustained focus on the protagonist's psychology. That is the destination here. Chopin landed somewhere past all three movements. Now, the key move here is that Chopin is never fully inside any one camp. She passes through each one, takes what serves her, and then keeps going. The sentimental novels gave her emotional range. The local colorists gave her technique and restraint. The New Women gave her impressionistic method and ambition. But her final work is not part of any of them. As for the author's stance here, that is straightforward admiration. Chopin is presented as being deliberate, someone who consciously evolved past each influence. The main trap here is pinning her to the last group mentioned. Because the new women come at the end of the passage, it's tempting to read her as being basically a new woman writer, but she's not. The passage says that she went further. So you want to watch for choices that collapse her into any single movement or that describe her as rejecting one group entirely because she borrowed from all of them. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to make sure you're clear on these three things. First, what exactly changed about the local colorist's writing when women's culture started disappearing? Second, how did Chopin manage to write about extreme emotions without falling into melodrama? And third, what does the phrase more fully tell you about Chopin's relationship to the new women? Is she one of them or is she past them? So that was passage 2, on to passage 3. This is LSAT Prep Test 133, Section 4, Passage 3, about ocean floor geology, how magnetic quirks in basalt led to the discovery that the ocean floor is spreading. It's a pretty low difficulty passage. It's a pretty straightforward one. It is a chronological science narrative. The passage traces a chain of discoveries. The main point is that unexpected magnetic patterns in the ocean floor basalt led scientists to figure out that new crust is constantly forming at mid-ocean ridges and spreading outward. And the evidence fits the theory almost perfectly. Now, the most important paragraph here is paragraph 2. That's where the author stops explaining background science and starts making their actual point. Everything before it is setup, everything after it is proof. Now, paragraph 1 opens with the old belief. The ocean floor hadn't changed in millions of years. Then we discover new findings that make that idea fall apart. And the rest of the paragraph explains the mechanism you've got to understand for everything that follows. Basalt contains magnetite. Magnetite is magnetic. You kind of figure that based on the name, right? When magma is still molten, the magnetite grains act like tiny compass needles and align with the Earth's magnetic field. When the rock cools, that alignment gets locked in permanently. And so basalt is basically a fossil record of which direction the Earth's magnetic field was pointing when that rock was formed. Now, some basalt has normal polarity, meaning it matches the current field. Some has reversed polarity, meaning the opposite. That's all you've got to pull from this paragraph. You don't want to get bogged down in the details about compass distortion on land. That's just explaining how scientists first noticed something was off, but it's not the point. Now, paragraph 2 is the heart of the passage. You want to slow way down here. When scientists mapped the ocean floor's magnetic variations, they found something pretty surprising. The rocks are arranged in stripes, alternating bands of normal and reversed polarity, lined up in rows on both sides of a massive underwater mountain range, the mid-ocean ridge. And the pattern is symmetrical. Scientists put it together. The ridges sit over weak spots in the Earth's crust. Hot magma rises up through those weak spots, cools into new rock, and then gets pushed outward as more magma comes up behind it. And over millions of years, the process of the ocean floor spreading built the mid-ocean ridge. Now, every sentence in this paragraph connects to the next one. The stripes explain the ridge. The ridge reveals the mechanism. The mechanism is the theory. And if you rush through here, you're going to lose the chain of events and the questions are going to punish you for it. Now, paragraph 3 exists for one reason, to prove the theory from paragraph 2 holds up. It stacks up several pieces of evidence. The rocks closest to the ridge crest are very young, and they get progressively older as you move away. The youngest rocks all have normal polarity, which makes sense if they formed recently. And then the big finish comes. Geophysicists already knew the dates of the Earth's magnetic reversals from studying continental rocks. When they compared those known dates to the striping pattern on the ocean floor, and they assumed the floor spreads at a steady rate, the ages matched up. The author calls that correlation remarkable. This is the closest the author gets to expressing an opinion in the entire passage, telling you the author thinks this evidence is pretty strong. Now, you could move through paragraph 3 at a pretty steady pace. Just grab each piece of evidence, understand what it supports, and then keep going. The key move here is that the final correlation between the magnetic reversal dates and the ocean floor striping pattern matches up. So the theory actually becomes kind of hard to argue with once you see that correlation. And you could bet the test writers are going to zero in on what that proves and what it doesn't prove. Now, there's a pattern running through this passage worth noticing. It's a cause and effect chain. Magnetic field reverses, magnetite records the reversal, magma cools and locks it in, new crust pushes old crust outward, and stripes form. Each step here depends on the one before it. If you see the chain, you can trace any question back to the right spot. Now, the author's stance here is pretty straightforward. The theory is well supported and the evidence is pretty convincing. There's no debate here, no skeptic, no alternative explanation. The trap here is inventing conflict that does not exist. If a choice suggests the author is weighing two theories or expressing doubt or calling for more research, that's wrong. The author laid out one story and backed it up. That is it. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on these three things. First, what specifically does the striping pattern on the ocean floor tell scientists? Second, why does the age of the rocks matter? What does it confirm? And third, what exactly makes that final correlation so convincing as evidence for ocean floor spreading? That was passage 3. We're going to do passage 4 now. This is LSAT Prep Test 133, Section 4, Passage 4. It's a comparative or dual passage set about objectivity in historical scholarship, medium difficulty set. The problem here is that these passages look like they're on opposite sides of a debate, but they're actually much closer than a fast read would suggest. And both of them ask the same question. What does it mean for a historian to be objective? Passage A gives you the traditional answer. Passage B complicates it. Now, passage A is the setup. You want to read at a normal speed here. It lays out the classic ideal of objectivity in 3 layers. First, facts are real and independent of interpretation. If your interpretation doesn't match the facts, you got to throw out the interpretation, not the facts. Second, just because different generations read events differently, that doesn't mean the events themselves have no fixed meaning. And third, the historian should be like a judge. They should be neutral, they should be balanced, and insulated from political pressure. Their loyalty should be to the truth and to other scholars who are also pursuing truth. And the analogy of being like a judge matters here, because passage B rejects that image of the historian. So passage B, you want to slow down, opens with something that sounds like agreement. They're saying historical scholarship has to be different from propaganda. Historians need self-discipline. They've got to abandon wishful thinking. They've got to throw out interpretations that fail basic tests of evidence. And so far, passage A will go along with all that. But then comes the most important sentence in the whole set. Objectivity should not be confused with neutrality. That is the core of the entire passage set. Everything after flows from that one distinction. Passage B says, objectivity is perfectly compatible with strong political commitment. The objective thinker doesn't value detachment for its own sake. They use it as a tool to understand more deeply. So where passage A says the historian should stay above the fight, passage B says no, get into the fight, but fight honestly. And then passage B describes what that looks like in practice. The ideal shows up in what it calls the powerful argument. That's an argument where you can tell the author genuinely engaged with the other side. The real opposing view, stated as carefully and as fairly as the opponent would state it themselves. Passage B actually says you've got to inhabit the rival position before you can attack it. You've got to live inside it first. And so that word inhabit's doing a lot of work there. It's telling you passage B isn't asking for surface level fairness. They're asking for deep engagement, totally different from what passage A is describing. Passage A wants you to keep some distance. Passage B wants you to engage in temporary closeness so that when you do take a side, your argument's going to be stronger for having honestly confronted what's against it. Then the ending of passage B says authentic objectivity has nothing in common with a TV newscaster who just splits time equally between two sides. So that mechanical balance, giving each side the exact same number of seconds, is a performance of objectivity, not the actual thing. Now, the key move here is that split between objectivity and neutrality in passage B. You got to keep that distinction in mind. Passage A treats neutrality as the heart of objectivity. Passage B says neutrality is actually the real enemy of objectivity because it leads to a fake mechanical balance instead of genuine engagement. Now, students will read these two passages and think passage B is anti-objectivity, but it's not. They love objectivity, but they define it differently. B rejects the neutrality part of passage A, not the commitment to truth itself. So the real relationship is actually that passage B would say passage A has the right goal, but the wrong method. Staying neutral doesn't get you to truth. making the strongest possible argument does. Now, before you get to the questions, you want to make sure you're clear on three things. First, can you define what passage B means by a powerful argument without just saying it's a good argument? Second, what would the author of passage B agree with passage A's comparison of the historian to a judge? And third, what exactly does the TV newscaster example at the end of passage B represent, and why does passage B reject it? So that was test 33, on to now test 32, 132. This is LSAT Prep Test 132, Section 1, Passage 1 about lichenometry, using lichen growth on rocks to date past earthquakes. It's a pretty low difficulty passage. It's a science passage. The author is making a simple case. Here's a new method, and here's why it's better than the old one. The main point in one sentence would be something like, lichenometry is a more accurate way to date recent earthquakes than radiocarbon dating. And the most important paragraph here is paragraph 3. That's where the author starts making their argument, but we're going to walk through the whole thing from the top. Paragraph 1 is setup. It explains how scientists currently study old earthquakes. They'll dig trenches, find shifted sediments, use radiocarbon dating to figure out when the ground moved. Now, you don't need to memorize any of this. Your only job here is to put the existing method on the table so that you can knock it down later. Read here at a pretty normal speed and then just move on. If you spent a lot of time here trying to figure out how carbon-14 decay works, you gave it more time than it needs. Now, paragraph 2 introduces the replacement. Bull and Brandon come up with lichenometry. And here's the idea, basically. Earthquakes knock rocks loose in mountain ranges. Then lichen, which is a combination of fungus and algae, moves on to the rock surfaces. And then it grows outward at a steady rate. So if you measure how big the lichen is, you can work backward to figure out when the rock was exposed. And if a whole bunch of rock falls across a wide area happened at the same time, that tells you there was a major earthquake. You can even estimate where the epicenter was because the rock falls thin out the farther you get from it. This is a lot of detail, but it's all just background. The author isn't yet making an argument. They're just explaining how the thing works. So read carefully enough that you could follow the logic here, but don't get bogged down in the specifics of growth rates. They're not going to ask you to make any calculations here. Now, paragraph 3 is where you slow down. This is the argument. The author comes right out and says lichenometry has distinct advantages. For example, radiocarbon dating is only accurate to within plus or minus 40 years. Lichenometry can date an earthquake to within 10 years. That's a huge gap here. But there's also a second issue with radiocarbon dating as well. Carbon-14 levels in the atmosphere have bounced around over the last 300 years. That makes radiocarbon dating unreliable for anything recent. And so for the exact time window you'd want the most accurate data for the last few centuries, the old method doesn't work. Then, right at the end of the passage, the author walks back their enthusiasm just a little bit. Lichenometry needs careful site selection. You've got to calibrate the lichen growth rates accurately. And it works best for earthquakes in the last 500 years. And environmental factors like shade, snow, and wind can mess with how fast lichen grows, so you've got to account for that. Now, the scientist here is not doubting things, they're just being responsible. Now, the key move here is the accuracy comparison in paragraph 3, 10 years versus 40 years. That's the difference, the hardest question to circle back to. Now, the author's stance here is clearly positive, but not absolutely enthusiastic. They think lichenometry is better for dating recent earthquakes, but they don't claim it works for everything, and they don't pretend it has no requirements. The trap here is going to extreme in either direction. A choice that says the author believes lichenometry should replace radiocarbon dating entirely would be too strong. If they said the author has serious reservations about the method, that's too weak. The whole passage is saying this is a better tool for a specific job. Now, the structure of this passage, I would say, is old method, new method, and then why the new method beats the old. And you've seen this in many other passages as well. Don't let the vocabulary trip you up here. Now, before you hit the questions, you want to check yourself on 3 things. First, why does the author spend an entire paragraph on radiocarbon dating before lichenometry even shows up? Second, what 2 specific weaknesses does the author use to make lichenometry look better than radiocarbon dating? And third, what does the author say has to be true for lichenometry to give you reliable results? So that was passage 1, on to passage 2. This is LSAT PrepTest 132, Section 2, Passage 1, about custom-made medical illustrations in personal injury cases. It's a law passage. The author is defending the illustrations, full stop. Every critic gets a turn to make their case, and the author takes away their arguments in turn. That's the whole passage. Now, paragraph 1 is just background. Courts have allowed custom medical illustrations for a while, but there's a fight about where they belong. The first critics showing up here are people who say that textbook illustrations work fine for most injuries. And they make a pretty fair sounding point that textbooks cover things like fractures and whiplash, but then they carve out an exception for unusual injuries. And so the exception they're giving here quietly weakens their own argument before the author even gets in. Then paragraph 2, you got to slow down. The second line of attack comes in saying that custom illustrations are basically propaganda. They're made to help one side win, not to actually show the truth. And even some lawyers agree with this. They think illustrators are just hired guns replacing expert testimony with pretty pictures. And the author says, first, a shady illustration still can't get into evidence unless a medical expert shows up to confirm it's accurate. And so we've got a safeguard there. And then the author flat out calls the worry a mistake. They say it is a mistake flat out. And they're telling you the author's pretty confident. They're just saying it's not somewhat overstated. Then paragraph 3, we get into the more subtle criticism, saying that people say custom illustrations distort the facts with color, emphasis, and exaggeration, even when they're technically accurate. And the author gives a good counter here. They're saying that professional illustrators actually go out of their way to avoid inflammatory content. Sometimes they skip color, they strip out details sometimes, and the author contrasts custom illustrations with textbook ones. Textbooks are overloaded with detail because they're built for medical students. In contrast, custom illustrations cut out everything that doesn't matter for the specific case. And you could bet they're going to have questions about this. Then paragraph 4 closes things out. Custom illustrations come from real medical data like x-rays, CT scans, and actual records. They show things that words can't show. And then the last piece of defense here is that the expert testimony is full of jargon, but judges and juries aren't doctors. They need visual help to understand what happened to somebody's body. So the illustrations translate expertise in a way they can understand. Now, the key move here is that the author never gives an inch. There are 3 separate criticisms in 3 different paragraphs, and each one gets dismantled bit by bit. So it's a consistent pattern that you could predict what's going to come in each subsequent paragraph based on what came before. The author here fully supports custom-made medical illustrations in court. The trap here is picking any answer that suggests the author is cautious or conflicted or only partially convinced. Nothing in this passage supports that. Every objection that comes up gets a direct rebuttal, and the author's only getting more confident as the passage goes on. Now, before you touch the questions, you want to check yourself on these 3 things. First, what is the actual evidence? What is the actual difference between textbook illustrations and custom ones? Not just what they look like, but why they serve different purposes. Second, why does the author think the hired gun criticism falls apart? And third, what problem in the courtroom does the author think these illustrations solve that nothing else can? Thanks for joining, folks. If you're looking for support, I'm offering a free LSAT tutoring lesson for everybody watching this now or later. The link to book that free tutoring with me is unpluggedprep.com/start. Link is below the video on YouTube, pinned in the chat on YouTube, in my bio on TikTok and IG as well. I'll be back in about an hour and a half for my daily live Q&A, anything at all, LSAT Law School admissions. See you all then. Thanks for joining.